The night sky over Odessa burns orange. Artillery shells whistle through the humid August air, exploding against the port city's ancient walls. Inside a dimly lit factory floor, a man named Pyotr Krasnov wipes grease from his calloused hands and stares at the absurdity before him. A tractor, a common STZ-5 agricultural tractor, the kind used to plow wheat fields and haul grain. And someone has just ordered him to turn it into a tank. The Romanian and German forces surrounding the city number over 300,000 soldiers. The Soviet defenders have fewer than 40,000. And their armor consists of precisely 12 operational tanks. 12 tanks against an army. Krasnov knows the math. Everyone knows the math. This homemade monstrosity will be his tomb. 300 kilometers away, a Romanian general named Nicolae Ciuperca examines reconnaissance photographs of the Soviet defensive positions. His intelligence officers laugh at the reports filtering in from the front lines. The Soviets are apparently welding steel plates onto farm equipment and calling them tanks. Desperation, Ciuperca mutters, tossing the photographs aside. This is what defeat looks like before it happens. He orders his artillery commanders to prepare for the final assault. Odessa will fall within the week. But Odessa does not fall within the week, because that tractor, that ridiculous machine cobbled together from scrap metal and agricultural equipment, is about to become one of the most unexpected weapons of the Second World War. And the men who mocked it will soon understand that courage, when combined with ingenuity, can transform even the impossible into reality. The year is 1941. Adolf Hitler's Operation Barbarossa has torn through Soviet defenses like a blade through paper. The Wehrmacht advances at a pace that stuns military observers worldwide. City after city falls. Kiev, Minsk, Smolensk. The German war machine appears unstoppable, its panzer divisions crushing everything in their path. But on the southwestern front, at the edge of the Black Sea, a single city refuses to surrender. Odessa. The Soviet High Command has declared the port strategically vital. It must be held at all costs, but holding it seems impossible. The Romanian Fourth Army, supported by German advisors and Luftwaffe air support, has encircled the city completely. Supply lines have been severed. Reinforcements cannot arrive. And the defenders are running out of everything: ammunition, food, medicine, and most critically, tanks. General Ivan Petrov commands the coastal army defending Odessa. He is a practical man, a soldier who understands that wars are won not by wishes, but by resources, and his resources are vanishing. His original armored contingent has been reduced to a handful of damaged vehicles, most of them missing tracks, engines, or both. The repair facilities cannot keep pace with the destruction. For every tank fixed, 2 more are lost. The mathematics of attrition spell inevitable doom. But Petrov refuses to accept inevitability. He summons his engineering officers to a meeting in the basement of a bombed-out textile factory. The room smells of diesel fuel and desperation. "Gentlemen," he says, spreading a city map across a wooden table scarred by shrapnel, "the enemy believes we are finished. They believe we have no armor left. I want you to prove them wrong." One of the younger engineers, a factory supervisor named Nikolai Glebov, clears his throat nervously. "General, we have examined every possibility. There are no tank chassis available, no spare parts, no armor plating thick enough to—" "I did not ask for excuses," Petrov interrupts. "I asked for solutions. What do we have? What resources exist within this city that could be converted into fighting vehicles?" The room falls silent. Outside, artillery rumbles like distant thunder. Then someone speaks. A mechanic from the January Uprising machine-building plant, a man whose name history would never properly record. "We have tractors," he says quietly, "the STZ-5s, dozens of them in the warehouses near the port. They were supposed to be evacuated, but the ships never came." The engineering officers exchange glances. "Tractors? Has the man lost his mind?" Petrov, however, does not dismiss the idea. He has seen stranger things in war. "Continue," he orders. The mechanic explains. The STZ-5 is a robust machine, originally designed for heavy agricultural work. Its chassis is strong, capable of bearing significant additional weight. Its tracks, while not designed for combat, provide excellent traction across varied terrain. And most importantly, there are dozens of them sitting idle while the city fights for survival. "You are proposing we armor them," Petrov says. It is not a question. The mechanic nods. "We can weld steel plates to the bodies, install machine gun turrets from damaged tanks. The engines will be strained, but they should function for limited combat operations. They will not be real tanks, General. But from a distance, in the chaos of battle, the enemy will not know the difference." Why? If you are fascinated by stories like this, where ordinary people accomplish extraordinary things under impossible circumstances, consider subscribing to this channel. We bring you the forgotten battles and unknown heroes of the Second World War, the stories that deserve to be remembered. General Petrov makes his decision within minutes. The project receives immediate authorization. Every available resource will be directed toward constructing these improvised tanks. The engineers have 2 weeks. The first prototype must roll off the factory floor before September. What follows is a remarkable display of Soviet improvisation. Workers from multiple factories collaborate around the clock. Sleep becomes a luxury no one can afford. The workshop floors echo with the sounds of hammering, welding, and the constant clanging of metal against metal. Pyotr Krasnov, the welder we met earlier, works 18-hour shifts attaching armor plates to tractor frames. His hands blister and crack. Sparks burn tiny holes in his overalls. But he does not stop. None of them stop. The design evolves through trial and error. The first attempt to mount a heavy turret fails catastrophically when the tractor tips backward during testing. The engineers reduce the turret weight and lower its center of gravity. The second prototype can move forward, but cannot turn without grinding to a halt. They redesign the track linkages. The third prototype overheats after 15 minutes of operation. They improve the ventilation system, cutting additional holes in the armor plating. By early September, the first operational NI tank emerges from the factory. The letters stand for Na Ispug, a Russian phrase meaning "for fright." The name acknowledges the vehicle's true purpose. It is not meant to defeat enemy armor in direct combat. It is meant to terrify infantry, to create psychological chaos on the battlefield, to make the enemy believe the Soviets have resources they do not actually possess. The finished product is a strange-looking machine. Its body is angular and crude, covered in mismatched armor plates of varying thickness. Some sections use steel from demolished buildings, others incorporate metal salvaged from sunken ships in the harbor. The turret mounts twin 7.62 mm machine guns, capable of devastating infantry at close range, but useless against actual tanks. A dummy cannon, fabricated from steel pipes, extends from the front, designed purely for visual intimidation. The NI tank weighs approximately 10 tons. Its maximum speed barely exceeds 20 kilometers per hour. Its armor, while effective against rifle fire, would crumple like paper against genuine anti-tank weapons. On every technical specification, it fails to qualify as a legitimate armored vehicle. But war does not care about specifications. War cares about what works. The operational testing occurs at night, far from enemy observation. The NI tanks rumble through the streets of Odessa, their engines producing a terrifying growl that echoes off the damaged buildings. Civilians who witness the procession later describe a sound like angry beasts awakening from slumber. The psychological effect, even on friendly observers, is profound. General Petrov observes the tests from a rooftop overlooking the demonstration area. His adjutant stands beside him, binoculars pressed to his eyes. "Well?" Petrov asks. The adjutant lowers the binoculars slowly. "Sir, if I did not know those were tractors, I would swear we had received reinforcements from Moscow. Petrov allows himself a rare smile. Then imagine what the Romanians will think. The plan for the NI tank's combat debut is audacious. On the night of September 20th, 1941, 20 improvised tanks will lead a surprise assault against Romanian positions in the southern sector of the Odessa perimeter. The attack will occur in complete darkness. The tanks will use headlights and sirens to maximize confusion. Infantry will follow closely behind, exploiting any breaches the tanks create. Everything depends on deception. The Romanians must believe they face a massive armored counterattack. If they discover the truth, that they are being assaulted by modified farm equipment, the entire operation collapses. The night of September 20th arrives with unusual stillness. The artillery bombardments that have plagued both sides for weeks fall silent. The soldiers waiting inside the NI tanks hear only the ticking of cooling engines and the distant murmur of the Black Sea. Pyotr Krasnov sits in the driver's seat of the fourth vehicle in the column. His hands grip the controls so tightly his knuckles turn white. The attack begins at 0200 hours. 20 engines roar to life simultaneously. 20 sets of headlights blaze into existence, cutting white paths through the darkness. 20 sirens begin wailing, a cacophony of sound designed to overwhelm and disorient. The column lurches forward. The NI tanks rumble across no man's land, their tracks churning through shell craters and barbed wire. Romanian sentries, startled awake by the sudden assault, fire wildly into the darkness. Their bullets ping harmlessly off the improvised armor plating, and then the screaming begins, not from the Soviet attackers, but from the Romanian defenders. In the chaos and confusion, with headlights glaring and sirens shrieking, and massive shapes emerging from the night like iron monsters, the Romanian infantry does what any reasonable soldier would do when facing what appears to be an overwhelming armored assault. They run. The breakthrough happens faster than anyone anticipated. The NI tanks smash through the first defensive line without encountering organized resistance. The second line crumbles within minutes. By the time the column reaches the fortified bunker complex that anchors the Romanian southern position, the defenders have already abandoned their posts. This is where the legend truly begins. The bunker complex consists of 6 reinforced concrete structures, each housing machine gun nests and mortar teams that have been pounding Soviet positions for weeks. Intelligence estimates suggest each bunker is defended by a platoon of Romanian soldiers supported by German advisors. Taking them would normally require days of sustained assault and hundreds of casualties. The NI tanks take them in 3 days, but not through direct combat, through terror. The first bunker falls when the defending soldiers witness an NI tank deliberately ram through the reinforced door, its improvised armor absorbing the impact while its crew fires machine guns through the opening. The defenders flee through a rear exit, convinced they are facing an unstoppable force. The second bunker surrenders after an NI tank circles it continuously for 4 hours, its siren wailing without pause. When Soviet infantry finally approaches, they find the Romanian garrison huddled in the corner, their weapons abandoned, their spirits completely broken. The third bunker is taken through an inspired act of psychological warfare. The NI tank assigned to assault it parks directly in front of the main firing slit and simply waits. Its engine idles. Its crew makes no aggressive moves. The dummy cannon points directly at the bunker entrance. For hours, nothing happens. Then, just before dawn, a white flag emerges from the bunker's ventilation shaft. The defenders believe they are outgunned and surrounded. They surrender without firing a shot. The fourth and fifth bunkers fall in similar fashion. The Romanian soldiers, having heard rumors of unstoppable Soviet tanks that cannot be destroyed, choose survival over resistance. By the time the NI tanks reach the sixth bunker, the defenders have already evacuated, leaving behind weapons, ammunition, and detailed maps of Romanian defensive positions throughout the sector. Pyotr Krasnov, the welder who never expected to survive his first combat mission, steps out of his NI tank as the sun rises over Odessa. His body aches from hours of vibration and stress. His ears ring from the constant noise. But he is alive, and he has helped accomplish something that military experts would have called impossible. The reports that reach Romanian headquarters describe a Soviet armored counterattack of unprecedented ferocity. Estimates of enemy tank strength range from 50 to over 100 vehicles. General Chuperka, the man who had dismissed the Soviets as defeated, demands to know where these tanks came from. His intelligence officers have no answer. The Soviets, as far as they knew, had no armor left to speak of. This is the true power of the NI tank, not its firepower, which was minimal, not its armor, which was barely adequate, but its ability to project strength where none existed, to transform perception into reality, to make the enemy believe what the Soviets needed them to believe. Over the following weeks, production of NI tanks accelerates dramatically. By the end of October, 69 improvised tanks have been built and deployed. They participate in numerous operations, some successful, some disastrous. Without proper anti-tank weapons, the NI tanks prove vulnerable to German 88mm guns when they are finally brought to bear. Several are destroyed when Romanian forces, having learned from their earlier panic, begin targeting the vulnerable areas of improvised armor. But the legend persists. Stories spread through the Romanian and German ranks of ghost tanks that appear from nowhere and vanish into darkness. Soldiers begin reporting NI tank sightings even in sectors where no improvised vehicles are operating. Fear becomes as much a weapon as any gun or explosive. This pattern of improvisation and psychological warfare repeats itself throughout the Second World War. Whenever conventional resources fail, ingenuity fills the gap. And nowhere is this more evident than in the hedgerows of Normandy, 3 years later, where another unlikely inventor transforms the course of battle. If you are enjoying this exploration of forgotten military history, take a moment to like this video. Your support helps us continue bringing these incredible stories to light. The Allied invasion of Normandy, which began on June 6, 1944, was the largest amphibious military operation in history. Over 150,000 soldiers landed on the beaches of northern France, supported by thousands of aircraft and naval vessels. The planning had taken months. The logistics involved millions of tons of supplies. Victory seemed assured once the beaches were secured. But the beaches were just the beginning. Beyond them lay the bocage. Bocage is a French word describing the distinctive countryside of Normandy, small fields separated by dense hedgerows, some over 1,000 years old. These hedgerows were not simple bushes. They were earthen embankments topped with trees and dense vegetation, sometimes rising 4 or 5 meters high. Their roots had interwoven for centuries, creating barriers as solid as concrete, and the Germans had turned every hedgerow into a fortress. The Allied advance, which had been expected to reach inland objectives within days, ground to a halt. Sherman tanks, the workhorses of the American armored forces, proved catastrophically vulnerable in the bocage. When a tank attempted to climb over a hedgerow, its front tilted upward, exposing its thin belly armor to German Panzerfaust teams hidden in the brush. Tank after tank was destroyed this way. Crews burned alive in vehicles they could not escape. The hedgerow country became a slaughterhouse. For 6 weeks, the most powerful army ever assembled remained trapped within a few kilometers of the beaches. Casualties mounted. Morale collapsed. General Omar Bradley, commanding the First Army, faced the very real possibility that the invasion would fail not because of German military superiority, but because of agricultural infrastructure that predated the Roman Empire. And then came Curtis Cullen. Sergeant Curtis Grub Cullen III was not an engineer. He had no advanced education or specialized training. Before the war, He had worked as a mechanic in New Jersey, fixing cars and trucks in a small garage. He was 29 years old, assigned to the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, and he was watching his fellow soldiers die in the hedgerows just like everyone else. Unlike everyone else, Cullen had an idea. He had noticed that the beaches where the invasion occurred were littered with German defensive obstacles. The most common were called check hedgehogs, massive iron constructions made of 3 heavy beams welded together in an X shape. They had been designed to rip open the hulls of landing craft, but the invasion had bypassed most of them. Now they sat uselessly on the sand, thousands of tons of high-quality steel going to waste. Cullen's idea was elegant in its simplicity. What if you welded sections of those hedgehogs to the front of a tank? What if, instead of climbing over hedgerows, the tank could cut through them? His commanding officers were skeptical. They had seen countless failed attempts to solve the hedgerow problem. Engineers had proposed explosive charges, specialized plows, even modified bulldozer blades. None had worked reliably. Why would a mechanic's idea be any different? But Cullen had something the engineers lacked: practical experience with machines and an instinct for what would actually function under combat conditions. He designed his device in a single night, sketching the concept on the back of a ration box. The next morning, with permission from his sergeant, he began construction. The prototype took 48 hours to build. Cullen and a small team of mechanics scavenged materials from the beach obstacles, cutting the iron beams with acetylene torches and shaping them into prongs approximately 60 centimeters long. They welded these prongs to a steel plate, which was then attached to the front hull of a Sherman tank. The final assembly resembled nothing so much as a set of giant metal teeth. The first test exceeded all expectations. The modified Sherman charged toward a hedgerow at full speed. The prongs bit into the earthen embankment, and instead of climbing upward, the tank drove straight through. Dirt and vegetation exploded in all directions. The tank emerged on the other side, its armor intact, its gun pointing forward and ready to engage. The entire breach took less than 30 seconds. Word of the successful test spread rapidly. Within hours, officers from multiple divisions arrived to observe demonstrations. By evening, General Bradley himself had inspected the device. He immediately ordered its adoption throughout First Army. The rush to produce Kulin cutters, as they became known, was frantic. Ordnance units worked around the clock, fabricating the devices from salvaged beach obstacles. By the time Operation Cobra launched on July 25th, 3 out of every 5 tanks in First Army had been equipped with the hedgerow-cutting prongs. The transformation on the battlefield was immediate and dramatic. Tanks that had previously been death traps became instruments of breakthrough. German positions that had held for weeks were overrun in hours. The Allied advance, stalled for over a month, resumed with devastating speed. Tanks equipped with the Kulin device earned the nickname Rhinos for their charging, horned appearance. They became symbols of American ingenuity, proof that individual initiative could triumph over seemingly insurmountable obstacles. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces, reportedly ordered 5,000 Cullen cutters manufactured after witnessing their effectiveness. The parallel between Curtis Cullen and the Soviet engineers of Odessa is striking. Both faced situations where conventional solutions had failed. Both turned to improvisation, using available materials to create weapons that military planners had never anticipated. And both demonstrated that the most important resource in warfare is not technology or numbers, but human creativity applied under pressure. The story of improvised tanks and improvised solutions reveals something fundamental about the nature of combat. Wars are planned by generals and strategists, but they are won by mechanics and welders, by soldiers who look at impossible problems and refuse to accept that no solution exists. Pyotr Krasnov, welding armor plates to tractors in a besieged city. Curtis Cullen, cutting up beach obstacles to create tank-mounted battering rams. Different nations, different circumstances, but the same essential truth. Innovation under fire changes everything. There is another dimension to these stories that deserves attention: the human cost and the human triumph. Behind every improvised tank, every jury-rigged solution, there were individuals who risked everything on unproven ideas. The first crews to take NI tanks into combat had no guarantee they would survive. The mechanics who tested the Cullen cutter prototype could not know whether their Sherman would emerge intact or explode in a fireball of fuel and ammunition. They acted on faith in their own abilities and faith in each other. The defenders of Odessa held out for 73 days against overwhelming odds. When the city was finally evacuated in October 1941, the Soviet forces conducted an orderly withdrawal by sea, taking most of their equipment and personnel with them. The NI tanks, too damaged and unreliable for further transport, were left behind. But the legend they created persisted. Romanian and German soldiers who had faced them told stories for years afterward about the strange, terrible machines that emerged from the darkness. Sergeant Curtis Cullen survived the war, though not without scars. He continued serving in Europe until the German surrender, then returned to civilian life in New Jersey. He received the Legion of Merit for his invention, though he never sought fame or recognition for his contribution to victory. He passed away in 1963, largely unknown to the public he had helped protect. Lafayette Green Poole, the Texas tanker known as War Daddy, destroyed 12 German tanks and over 250 armored vehicles in 81 days of combat across France and Belgium. His Sherman tank, named In the Mood, spearheaded 21 major assaults. When his final tank was destroyed near the Siegfried Line in September 1944, Poole was thrown from the vehicle with severe leg injuries. He survived, but his war was over. In his brief time in combat, Poole had demonstrated that skill and audacity could overcome the technical superiority of German armor. His tactics inspired American tankers throughout the European theater. These stories interweave and reinforce each other: the NI tanks of Odessa, the Rhino tanks of Normandy, the Sherman crews who fought against Panthers and Tigers with inferior equipment but superior determination. Together they form a narrative of adaptation, courage, and the refusal to accept defeat. The German military, despite its reputation for engineering excellence, was remarkably slow to develop similar improvisations. German doctrine emphasized standardization and mass production of proven designs. When field modifications were attempted, they often lacked official support or resources. This rigidity, which had served the Wehrmacht well during offensive operations, became a liability as the war turned defensive. While American and Soviet forces constantly adapted their equipment to meet new challenges, German units frequently awaited solutions that never arrived from Berlin. This contrast offers valuable lessons for understanding military effectiveness. The armies that won the Second World War were not necessarily those with the best equipment or the most resources. They were armies that empowered individual soldiers to solve problems, that valued practical results over bureaucratic approval, and that recognized innovation as a force multiplier equivalent to additional divisions. Subscribe now if you want to continue learning about the incredible stories of World War II that history books often forget. The battles we cover reveal the true nature of warfare, not just strategy and tactics, but human ingenuity and the will to survive. The legacy of improvised armored vehicles extends far beyond 1945. In every conflict since the Second World War, combatants have modified civilian equipment for military purposes. The fundamental lesson of the NI tank and the Cullen cutter remains relevant. When conventional solutions fail, unconventional approaches may succeed. Consider the circumstances that drove these innovations. In Odessa, desperation created necessity. There were no other options. Either the Soviets built something from what they had, or they lost the city without a fight. In Normandy, frustration drove creativity. The hedgerows had defeated every orthodox approach. Only by thinking outside established doctrine could Kulin and others find a way forward. These conditions, desperation and frustration, are not unique to wartime. They appear whenever systems fail and established methods prove inadequate. The ability to improvise, to look at available resources with fresh eyes and imagine new applications distinguishes those who overcome obstacles from those who are defeated by them. There is something deeply moving about the image of Soviet workers welding armor plates to tractors while artillery shells explode around them. They had no training in tank construction. They had no blueprints or design specifications. They had only determination and whatever materials they could scavenge from a dying city. And from that determination, they created weapons that changed the trajectory of a siege. Equally moving is the image of Curtis Kulin sketching his design on a ration box, then spending 48 hours building a prototype that military engineers had failed to conceive. He was not smarter than the engineers. He simply approached the problem from a different perspective, seeing possibilities where trained experts saw only impossibilities. The 2nd of October 1941 marks the most successful operation involving NI tanks. Near the village of Liebenthal in the suburbs of Odessa, a combined force of improvised tanks and Soviet infantry attacked units of the Romanian Fourth Army. The assault achieved complete surprise. The Romanians, having spread rumors among their own troops about invincible Soviet armor, fell victim to their own psychological warfare. Panic spread through the defensive positions before the first shots were fired. The result was a rout. 24 Romanian artillery pieces were captured along with numerous machine guns and mortars. German liaison officers reported to Berlin that Soviet armored forces had executed a textbook combined arms assault with overwhelming firepower. The reality that the overwhelming firepower consisted largely of tractors with welded-on metal plates remained classified for decades. 7 NI tanks were destroyed in the Liebenthal operation, representing a significant portion of the total improvised force. But the psychological impact on the Axis forces far exceeded the tactical importance of the engagement. Romanian commanders, already struggling with morale problems and supply shortages, began reporting exaggerated estimates of Soviet strength that would influence strategic decisions for weeks afterward. This phenomenon, where improvised weapons achieve effects disproportionate to their actual capabilities, recurs throughout military history. The German V-1 flying bombs launched against London in 1944 caused relatively few casualties but generated massive psychological impact. The Iraqi Scud missiles launched during the Gulf War of 1991 were militarily insignificant but dominated international news coverage. Perception shapes reality in war as much as physical force. The men who crewed the NI tanks understood this implicitly. They knew their vehicles could not survive genuine armored combat. They knew their machine guns could not penetrate German tank armor. But they also knew that the enemy could not immediately distinguish between a real tank and a convincing fake. In the crucial seconds of confusion that followed the appearance of an NI tank, infantry would break, positions would be abandoned, and opportunities would be created. Pyotr Krasnov, if he survived the war, likely never received recognition for his role in the NI tank program. Soviet military historiography tended to emphasize collective achievement over individual contribution. The workers who built the improvised tanks, the crews who drove them into combat, the engineers who solved impossible problems under impossible conditions, most of their names are lost to history. But their legacy endures. Every time a modern military force adapts commercial technology for battlefield use, Every time a field modification improves equipment performance, every time an individual soldier identifies a creative solution to a tactical problem, they echo the tradition established in Odessa and Normandy. The spirit of improvisation, of refusing to accept limitations as permanent, defines the difference between armies that adapt and armies that stagnate. The hedgerows of Normandy still stand. Visitors can walk the Bocage country and see the ancient earthen embankments that stopped the most powerful army of its era. Occasionally, rusted fragments of culin cutters still emerge from the soil, artifacts of a moment when a mechanic's intuition broke a strategic deadlock. The tractors that became tanks in Odessa have all disappeared, destroyed in combat, or scrapped in the decades after the war. No NI tank survives in any museum collection. The only evidence of their existence comes from photographs, documents, and the memories of those who witnessed them in action. But absence of physical artifacts does not diminish historical significance. The NI tanks prove that human creativity can transform the humblest materials into instruments of war. What conclusions can we draw from these interconnected stories? First, that military effectiveness depends as much on adaptability as on equipment. The forces that won the Second World War were those that empowered individual initiative and rewarded practical solutions. Second, that psychological effects often exceed physical effects. The NI tanks neutralized more enemy soldiers through fear than through firepower. Third, that innovation emerges from constraint. Neither the Odessa tanks nor the culin cutter would have been developed if conventional solutions had been available. Necessity truly is the mother of invention. And finally, that ordinary people, given extraordinary circumstances, consistently rise to meet impossible challenges. Pyotr Krasnov was a welder, Curtis Culin was a mechanic, Lafayette Poole was a tank commander with no college education, yet each of them, in their own way, changed the course of history. The mockery that greeted the first NI tanks reveals something about human nature. We are quick to dismiss ideas that challenge our assumptions. When someone proposes welding armor to a tractor, our instinct is to laugh, not to ask whether it might work. When someone suggests cutting up beach obstacles to solve a tactical problem, our instinct is to defer to the experts rather than test the hypothesis. The innovators who overcome this resistance are not necessarily the smartest or the most educated. They are often simply those who refuse to accept that established limits are permanent. They look at a tractor and see a tank. They look at a beach obstacle and see a hedgerow cutter. They look at impossible odds and see opportunities. This capacity for reframing problems, for seeing possibilities where others see only obstacles, is perhaps the most valuable attribute a soldier or leader can possess. It cannot be taught in classrooms or measured by tests. It emerges from experience, from necessity, and from the fundamental human drive to survive and prevail. The siege of Odessa ended in evacuation, but it was not a defeat. The defenders had held for over 2 months against forces that should have overwhelmed them in days. They had inflicted enormous casualties on the Axis armies, delayed the German advance toward the Caucasus oil fields, and demonstrated that Soviet resistance was far from broken. The NI tanks played a crucial role in this achievement, not by destroying enemy armor, but by creating confusion, maintaining pressure, and allowing their crews to accomplish more than anyone had thought possible. The Battle of Normandy ended in Allied victory, with German forces driven from France and the liberation of Paris in August 1944. The hedgerows that had threatened to trap the invasion became merely terrain features to be crossed rather than obstacles to be feared. The culin cutter, simple in concept and execution, had solved a problem that threatened to determine the outcome of the war. These stories remind us that history turns on small hinges, decisions made by individuals, inventions conceived in desperation, moments of courage that could easily have ended differently. If the first NI tank had been destroyed immediately upon deployment, the entire improvisation program might have been abandoned. If Kulin's prototype had failed its initial test, another solution might never have emerged in time. The outcomes we now consider inevitable were at the time anything but certain. There is something humbling about this recognition. The veterans who survived these experiences knew how close they came to failure. They understood that luck, timing, and circumstance played roles as significant as skill or courage. The crews of the NI tanks knew they were driving death traps. The soldiers who followed Kulin's rhinos through the hedgerows knew that any given breach might be the one where German defenses held. They advanced anyway because the alternative was accepting defeat. If this story has moved you, share it with others who appreciate the remarkable courage and ingenuity of those who fought in the Second World War. Every share helps us continue telling these essential stories. The connection between the Soviet improvisers of Odessa and the American innovators of Normandy spans continents, cultures, and circumstances. Yet the underlying pattern remains consistent. When standard solutions fail, human beings improvise. When resources are scarce, creativity fills the gap. When experts declare problems unsolvable, someone without expert training finds a way forward. This is the true lesson of the homemade tank that destroyed 6 German bunkers in 3 days. Not that improvisation always succeeds, because it often fails. Not that courage always prevails, because it sometimes does not. But that the human capacity for adaptation, for innovation, for finding possibilities within constraints, represents our greatest resource in any conflict. The men who welded armor to tractors in Odessa did not know their creations would become legends. They were simply doing what needed to be done with what they had available. The mechanic who designed the Kulin cutter did not realize he was solving a strategic problem that threatened the entire Allied invasion. He was simply applying his practical experience to an immediate tactical challenge. Greatness often emerges from such modest origins. The decisive moments of history frequently involve individuals who never sought fame or recognition, who simply saw a problem and attempted to solve it. Their stories deserve to be remembered, not as military curiosities, but as examples of what human beings can accomplish when circumstances demand extraordinary responses. The night of September 20th, 1941, over Odessa, 20 improvised tanks charging into darkness, headlights blazing, sirens screaming, Romanian soldiers fleeing positions they had held for weeks. A breakthrough achieved not through superior firepower, but through psychological shock and the courage of crews who knew their vehicles were barely adequate for the mission. July 1944, in the hedgerows of Normandy. Sherman tanks with crude metal prongs crashing through barriers that had stopped an entire army. The breakthrough that began the liberation of France, made possible by a mechanic's insight and 48 hours of welding. These moments represent the essence of warfare, not the clash of machines or the application of doctrine, but human beings finding ways to prevail against seemingly impossible odds. The tanks themselves were secondary. The spirit that animated them was primary, and that spirit endures. Wherever soldiers face challenges without adequate resources, wherever conventional solutions fail and innovation becomes necessary, the legacy of the NI tanks and the Kulin cutters provides inspiration. Ordinary people, extraordinary circumstances, unexpected victories. They mocked his homemade tank. They laughed at the absurdity of armor-plated tractors facing German artillery. They dismissed the idea that scrap metal from beach obstacles could solve a problem that had stopped the most powerful army in history. They were wrong. The bunkers fell. The hedgerows were breached. The improvised solutions worked. And the men who had been mocked, the welders and mechanics and common soldiers, became the heroes whose ingenuity changed the course of the greatest conflict in human history. This is their story, This is their legacy, and this is the truth that every generation must relearn. That the most powerful weapon in any conflict is not technology or numbers, but the human mind applied to impossible problems with the determination to find solutions where none should exist. The homemade tanks of Odessa. The rhino tanks of Normandy, the spirit of improvisation that refuses to accept defeat. They remind us what we are capable of when circumstances demand our best, and they challenge us to approach our own obstacles with the same creativity, the same courage, and the same refusal to accept that impossible means permanent.